Hey guys, welcome to the field topic analysis for Resolved in the United States National Service ought to be compulsory. Before we jump into what I think are some of the core Aff and neg positions, I'm going to talk about the general history of the topic, some definitions that you should keep in mind, and some key questions that will become really important as you start to delve into the philosophical literature. So first, for a brief history of the topic, conscription and mandatory national service were largely rejected after the American Revolution and during the Civil War because people thought that it constituted a huge violation of freedom. This is something that was subverted during World War I and World War II because enrollment in the army was thought of as something that was fundamental to American citizenship. But this was again something that was reversed during the Vietnam War, where people had really large opposition to the ideology that the United States had when entering into the war. So moving on to definitions, the first definition that you will encounter of national service is just national service as military service, which means that during peacetime individuals have to be involved in the military. And the second one is a definition as community service. So through involvement through programs like AmeriCorps would be things that would constitute national service. I think that this definition debate is something that's super important to keep in mind when constructing philosophical positions because it's much easier to generate Aff offense when you're defending the second definition of national service over the first one because you can get offense to things like civic engagement and an obligation for individuals to be involved in their community, which is much easier to defend than the merit of being involved in the military, although you can definitely generate offense using both. So here are a couple of key issues that you should keep in mind when you're constructing a philosophical position. So first is the actor that the resolution is talking about, because as the actor in the resolution varies, so do the philosophical theories that would apply. So I think that likely the actor in the resolution would just be the federal government by establishing some sort of mandatory program in which individuals are punished through not being engaged in national service, which means that you want to be looking into political philosophies, not moral philosophies, because those are the kind of things that will establish the moral obligation for the government. But I think it's also possible that there could be some sort of Aff that specifies, for example, an educational institution. So people could read a plan that specifies high schools and says that that there should be a service requirement in order for individuals to graduate. And that's a really interesting component of the topic because that enables you to delve into a lot of educational philosophy about the particular obligations that educators have when constructing policies that should regulate students. The next thing that you should think about is implementation mechanisms. So what I mean by that is things like how long do individuals have to do national service, how are individuals going to be punished if they fail to do national service. I think the second one is especially important when you're reading something like a rights-based Aff, because the rights that individuals will be deprived as a result of not cohering with the Aff could potentially be really strong offense to link turn your Aff. So that's something that you want to keep in mind when you're deciding what your implementation mechanism should be. Because if you're reading a freedom-based Aff with something like individuals going to jail for a long period of time as a punishment, that's something that individuals could either read a counterplan out of or also just read really compelling case turns about. The next thing you want to think about is specification. So do you want to defend all forms of national service or do you want to just defend a particular program? I think that it would be a good idea to look into the different programs that exist because there's probably a lot of philosophical literature about why particular forms of community service are good, which could make for a really strong, specific Aff offense. I think also one type of specification that might make sense on this resolution is some sort of plan that enables individuals to decide the type of community service or national service they end up being involved in. And that's something that you might want to think about doing if you're reading some sort of freedom-based Aff, because it gives individuals the capacity to decide what sorts of things they're going to be involved in. And the last thing you want to think about when you're writing your Aff is if there will be exceptions. So it seems potentially like the idea of mandatory national service is something that would universally apply to all citizens, but it's potentially the case that individuals, for example, people who are disabled, individuals who are younger, would not have the same sorts of things apply to them. I think this is super important because things like conscientious objectors, whether or not they have to do national service, could potentially be a big issue for NCs, such as a Rawls NC, which would say that we have to respect pluralism and individuals' fundamental beliefs within society. So next is just some general questions to think about which I think should guide your research and the way that you think about a lot of these positions and a lot of the topic, because I think that any position that you are writing should be able to answer all of these questions, and if it doesn't, you're missing a fundamental component of your position. So the first one is, even if individuals are morally obligated to participate in national service, can the government coerce them into doing it? So this is important, especially for things like a Virtue Aff that would say that it is desirable for individuals to engage in community service. It doesn't necessarily follow from that the government is authorized in forcing them to do so. So if your Aff doesn't have the capacity to explain why government coercion is legitimate, then you're going to run into a lot of problems when you're hitting negative positions and defending yourself against case turns. The second issue is service as meaningful a component of citizenship if it's coerced? So this is a thing that you especially want to be thinking about with Affs like the Civic Republicanism Aff, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which say that individuals have an obligation to become members of political society and have some sort of duty to be engaged within it. So even if it is the case that service is a necessary way to show your respect for society and your engagement within it, you want to think about ways that you can deal with negative arguments about how service is not meaningful when the government is forcing individuals to become engaged in society. The next thing to think about is just a general question. What is the purpose of national service? So you want to be thinking about the function that it's supposed to serve within society, and that's also an issue that you want to think about when you're determining specification. So certain forms of national service are definitely going to be more influential in fulfilling a particular purpose than other forms of service. So for example, if you want to do something about civic engagement, then maybe some sort of program that forces individuals to learn about the political system rather than something that talks about the military would be something that would be important for your Aff. The next one is what rights will be denied to individuals who opt out of national service. I think the issues with this are just similar to the issues I talked about with implementation mechanisms, because that's definitely also a very fruitful place for individuals to read counterplans. So I think process counterplans will definitely be something that are smart to have on this topic, because you could potentially read arguments as to why, for example, sending individuals to prison is bad, so we should punish individuals with a fine for not following laws about mandatory national service. And the last question, which I think is something that would be helpful to think about in terms of constructing negative positions, is do individuals have an obligation to give back to the government if the government fails to protect certain fundamental rights? So a lot of Aff arguments will say things along the lines of, we have to give up fundamental freedoms in order for the government to be able to protect us. But that argument seems to be weird in situations in which the government is failing to fulfill its obligations. So that can give you access to a lot of negative philosophical arguments about how the government does not have the right to infringe on our freedom when they aren't even guaranteeing individual freedom in the first place. So the first Aff position I'm going to talk about is just a generic freedom Aff. So there are a couple of articles that talk about this. First is an article by Carter called Liberalism and the Obligation to Military Service, which basically says that it is a necessary component of the existence of a democratic state that citizens are engaged in it and are able to give up certain freedoms in order to support fundamental components of the state security, like the military and state's operation through like community service programs. And the second argument, which I think is a little bit more interesting, is made in Gobry's article, which talks about our duty to our forefathers who fought for us to be able to engage in society. So it represents a duty to them when we do things like national service that are able to uphold their honor. I don't think that this is the best Aff argument because there are a lot of potential issues with it, but I think it's definitely a position that individuals will likely read on it, so it's something that you want to have prepped out. The first issue with the Aff is that it's pretty vulnerable against Ks. So things like biopower that say that like establishing the state's authority and our obligations to it and like ceding ourselves to the state is a bad thing would link super, super hard into this Aff that says like our freedom is only possible through the existence of the state. And things like Afropest that contest the idea that the state is able to guarantee everyone's freedom are things that this Aff would link super, super hard into, and I don't think has a lot of ability to leverage against. The second thing is that it's pretty easily turnable through arguments like the Libertarianism NC, especially because national service is something that only exists during peacetime, so it doesn't seem like something that would be necessary for national security. So it doesn't seem necessarily like a fundamental right that individuals have to give up. The third thing is that it probably relies on solvency. So if you don't prove that it is actually effective for us to have national service, then it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that it's obligatory or that it's a necessary right that we have to give up in order for the state to exist. Which means that you might end up getting into some like nitty-gritty util debates and not being able to exclude as much offense as you'd like. The next aff is the civic republicanism aff, which I think is probably a stronger argument. So Philip Pettit writes a lot about civic republicanism, and the basic idea behind civic republicanism is just that we care about freedom as non-domination, which means freedom from arbitrary interference. So that's distinct from the libertarian conception of freedom, where it's just a question of whether or not someone is interfering with your capacity to set a particular end, rather than just that someone has arbitrary power over you, in which they have the potential possibility of deciding what ends you will set in the future. So the way in which civic republicanism defines freedom as non-domination is that arbitrary interference is freedom that is when someone interferes with an individual and they don't have the capacity to consent to that interference. So that requires things like engagement within civil society, so that individuals can shape the laws and policies that influence them. So you can definitely find a lot of civic republican literature that talks about the importance of civic engagement, because that will be the lines along which you want to construct the contention for this aff. So you guys should look at the Carter 98 article, which is in the Dropbox, because that definitely has some stuff that will be super useful for the contention. And also the Dion 03 article. One thing that I think would potentially be interesting is a plan about having mandatory national service for felons as a means of them gaining back their rights, because that is a way in which they could become engaged in society and be able to actually consent to the things that influence them, rather than being arbitrarily dominated, since they don't have things like the right to vote. The potential issue with this plan is that it might be extra topical, but it's definitely something to look into and to think about plans along that nature. Or it could potentially be a contention level argument in a civic republican aff that talks about how it is a necessary way in which we can reintegrate individuals into society to ensure that they have a voice. Here are some potential issues I think you might run into with a civic republican aff. The first is that people will read the Libertarianism NC against it, and they might read really long dumps about how freedom as non-domination is a worse theory than freedom as non-interference. So Philip Pettit talks a lot about why freedom as non-interference is not a sufficient account of ethics, so you should definitely cut a lot of those articles and have them ready to read in the 1AR in order to deal with NC dumps about why libertarianism comes first. The second argument is that a lot of the aff relies on the idea of civic virtue and individuals becoming re-engaged within society in order to represent themselves, but there is the potential that people might read a lot of advantage counterplans that also encourage civic virtue. For example, I found an article that talked about the idea of universal national service, which would provide everyone the opportunity to become engaged in national service and provide incentives to do it, i.e. through things like having individuals talk about it in educational spaces, but it wouldn't be mandatory, with net benefits about how civic virtue will not be cultivated if it's coerced by the government. So you definitely want to think of strategies to have against counterplans like that in order to ensure that they're not able to hijack all of your aff. The next issue is that it's potentially easily turnable. So I found a book called National Service, Citizenship, and Political Education by Eric B. Gorham, which just basically talks about how the aff is the wrong approach to creating the the ideal citizen within the republic. So that's definitely something that you guys should look into cutting on the negative, because I think that civic republicanism will probably be an argument that's read a lot on the aff. And the last issues I think are pretty similar to the issues that the freedom aff runs into, in which case they both link pretty hard into biopower and Afropest. So you definitely want to think about ways to deal with those arguments and ways you want to leverage the aff against them, because you're definitely going to run into them a lot. So the next argument is pretty similar. It's just a more specific kind of civic republicanism. So this would be an aff using a lot of Hannah Arendt's work. So there's an article called Hannah Arendt, A Reinterpretation of Her Political Thought, which talks about why Arendt believes that jury service should be mandatory because it encourages individuals to become engaged within political society and to give back to it. So that's something that I would look into cutting if you wanted to read an Aff like this. The Aff also has, Arendt also has a theory of education that might be really useful if you wanted to read a plan, for example, about requiring service for individuals to graduate from high school. And she talks a lot about the idea of natality and the obligation for individuals in society to reconcile with the history of their nation. So you could read some sort of plan that requires engagement and volunteer work that forces individuals to come to like deal with the history of the United States. And then you could read arguments about natality, which would be super specific to the plan that you're reading. The next Aff is an Aristotelian Virtue Aff. So this just talks about how it instills in individuals the values of service, responsibility, and community engagement. Because just in general, it is a good thing for individuals to become engaged in society because it teaches them the value of community service. There are a couple of articles that I found that talked about this. So there's the 016 article and the Raspberry 90 article. So I definitely cut both of those since they talk about how, especially the second article talks about why even if virtue is forced, it is still a good thing because it instills in individuals the value of becoming engaged in their community. The other thing that this Aff could talk about is pacifism. So this is similar to the militarism Aff that people are probably talking about in the other topic analyses, which is just that once individuals become more engaged in the military, everyone in society has to bear the consequences of a war, which means that in general, society becomes more opposed to engagement in war and becomes more pacifistic. So you could read arguments about why hawkishness is something that's not virtuous, and that could be an interesting argument in the Aff that I don't think a lot of people will have. But there are some potential problems with virtue ethics that you should definitely keep in mind if you want to write this Aff when you're doing frontlines. So the issue I talked about before about how can virtue be coerced, you definitely want to write a bunch of blocks to this with almost every Aff about civic virtue. Also the advantage counterplans that I talked about with the other Aff, and K's about military culture. So things that say that the military is hyper-masculine or the military is homophobic would be things that would impact turn your Aff because they would say that the values that individuals have when they are involved in the military are things that are problematic. I think a plan would probably get out of a lot of these problems. So if you were to specify a specific AmeriCorps program that you think individuals should become involved in, and read arguments as to why that particular program instills virtues, that would get out of a lot of the critiques that Neg would read. Next is Communitarianism. This one's pretty straightforward. It just says that our duty is to give back to the community and that national service is a mechanism of giving back. I don't think this is a great Aff just because communitarianism as a framework doesn't make a lot of sense because the way in which communitarian frameworks are generally constructed is along the lines of, first, our identities are created within a communal context, which second means that because our identities are created within that context, we have an obligation to give back to the community, which third means that if we're not giving back to the community, the government is justified in coercing us to do so. I think the link between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 are super, super tenuous. Just because we derive our sense of identity from a particular context doesn't mean we have an obligation to promote the thing that gave us that sense of identity. So, for example, if you're in a school and the school tells you, and you learn in school that nuclear war is bad, you don't have more of an obligation to protect the school than to prevent nuclear war, which means that even if the way in which we formulate ethical values is within the community, it doesn't seem like we have to maximize the community itself. But this is definitely an argument people will be reading. I think most of the blocks to the other Affs will apply to this. But I think also one issue with communitarianism is it has a very hard time defining what the communal good actually is, which means that it's super vulnerable to hijacks with things like util frameworks with extinction impacts. Next, which an Aff that I think is really strategic is a Pragmatism Aff. So if you're writing a Pragmatism Aff, you would want to read it with pragmatist political philosophy. So pragmatist political philosophy is just the pragmatist theory of democracy, which just says that we should have openness in society where individuals are able to become engaged and to contribute their own ideas to determining what sorts of policies the government is able to carry out. So it's very much a theory of openness and engagement within society, and has a super strong theory of education that's attached to it. So the theory of education talks about how individuals need to learn about the way the government works, and to learn about specific policies and civil society so that they become engaged in it, and have an active role in like shaping their own lives. So I think this would be really strategic with a plan about how schools should mandate national service in order for individuals to graduate, along with a definition about how national service is defined through involvement through things like AmeriCorps, because that kind of plan would ensure that would talk about how educators have a specific responsibility to ensure that individuals are educated about the society in which they live. And then you could read some compelling arguments about how involvement in community service is exactly the way to do that. The only thing that you probably want to be careful about with this Pragmatism Aff is that I think there's a strong pragmatism argument on neg as well. So I'll get to that when I talk about neg positions. So first neg position is just the Freedom NC, which is just libertarianism. So you guys should read The Ethics of Liberty by Murray Rothbard if you're interested in writing this. These are some other sources that I think would be good to look at for writing Libertarianism NC. The argument would just go along the lines of that the government does not have the authority to interfere with us and force us to be involved in national service, because they only are entitled to protect things like our right not to be murdered, or our right to property, or our right not to be assaulted. The next would be a Kant NC. So for this, you should use Kantian political philosophy, not Kantian moral philosophy. So by that I mean you want to be reading arguments that are similar to Ripstein's about the Kantian theory of property, and about how the state exists because the only way in which individuals can have property rights is if there's an omnilateral will that makes property rights authoritative rather than something that is merely contingent on the will of other people, because that's the philosophy that Kant has that actually applies to what the state's particular obligations are, whereas Kantian moral philosophy just talks about what individual actors ought to do. So the argument here would be pretty similar to the Libertarianism NC, just would say that the government is not entitled to compel us to carry out national service, because we can imagine a world in which everyone does not carry out national service and there's still the existence of the state, and the state is only able to restrict freedoms that are a violation of, or like restrict actions that are a violation of other people's freedom, but your decision not to partake in national service is obviously not one of those things. The next argument would be a Rawls NC. So it's kind of similar to the libertarianism and the Kant arguments in that it would say that it's a violation of freedom for individuals to be forced to do national service. But the argument would be a little bit distinct in that it would say that our right not to be compelled to do national service is a primary good. So Rawls talks about this in chapter 6 of A Theory on Justice, and says that it is only just to compel people into national service if it is key to national security. This could be read with a pick, but it also seems pretty intuitive that it would just negate regardless, because national service is only something that happens in peacetime. If there's a draft because of a war, in which case there'd actually be a security concern, it doesn't seem like the Aff would apply. The next thing is that if the Aff doesn't apply to if the Aff applies to conscientious objectors, and that it makes people who have serious ideological opposition to engagement in national service, forces them to engage in it, it would seem to disrespect the plurality that is essential within a democracy, which is something that Rawls talks about as being really important. The next argument is the Aristotelian Virtue NC. So this would just say what I was talking about in the potential flaws with the Aristotle Aff, which would talk about how virtue can't be coerced and how the state should engage in other sorts of programs to ensure that individuals desire to be engaged in national service, rather than compelling them to do it. Last is the Pragmatism NC. So in order to justify the framework here, you would not want to use the Deweyan arguments that you'd be using for the Pragmatism Aff, which talk about the pragmatist theory of democracy. You'd want to justify it more in terms of non-political philosophy. So you should read articles by C.S. Peirce and Williams James. So I can send you guys recommendations if you're interested in delving into this NC. But How to Make Our Ideas Clear by C.S. Pierce is definitely a good place to start because it talks about how we need an experimental philosophy that is super particularist in order to account for moral uncertainty and the complexity of ethical situations. So the main argument here would just be a particularism argument that just says that a universal requirement that individuals engage in national service ignores the particularities of individual circumstances, and there are definitely some important, compelling negative arguments that you could use to justify why particularism is important in the context of things like national service. So, for example, individuals who have like serious ethical objections to engagement with the United States government should be given consideration. And also, individuals who have been excluded from society and who the government has failed to protect don't seem to have a sort of reciprocal obligation to the government in order to give back to it insofar as it's not protecting them. So there are definitely compelling critical-esque arguments that you could pair with the Pragmatism NC in order to prove that this sort of universal requirement that everyone has to engage in national service ignores the particularities individuals face that might mean that they don't have an obligation to do that. A good article to read is one by this guy Pappas called The Pragmatist Approach to Injustice, and that talks about why particularism is super important when you're approaching ethical dilemmas, especially when you're dealing with issues of oppression. So those are my main thoughts about the philosophical components of this topic. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about anything that I talked about, or want any article recommendations to look more into any of the positions that I talked about.